From New York, this is Democracy Now!
There's not another serious scientist in the world who thinks it's going to be over soon.
President Trump, your reaction?
I say over soon. I say we're learning to live with it.
Learning to live with it. Come on. We're dying with it.
As the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 tops 223,000, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden sparred in the second and final debate of the 2020 campaign over Trump's response to the pandemic, health care, climate change, racism, and U.S. immigration policy.
Their kids were ripped from their arms and separated. And now they cannot find over 500 of sets of those parents, and those kids are alone. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. It's criminal. It's criminal.
Let me ask
Kristen,
you about
I will say this. They went down. We brought reporters, everything. They are so well taken care of.
We'll air debate excerpts and speak with immigration rights activist Erica Andiola, the epidemiologist Dr. Ali Khan, and Rashad Robinson. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 tops 223,000, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden met in Nashville, Tennessee Thursday in the second and final debate of the 2020 presidential campaign. They sparred over the Trump administration's response to the pandemic, climate change, racism, U.S. immigration policy, and health care. At one point in the 90-minute debate, Trump conflated Biden's call for a government-run public option health care plan with Medicare for All bill authored by Senator Bernie Sanders.
When he talks about a public option, he's talking about destroying your Medicare, totally destroying, and destroying your Social Security. And this whole country will come down. You know, Bernie Sanders tried it in his state.
He's a very confused guy. He thinks he's running against somebody else. He's running against Joe Biden. I beat all those other people because I disagreed with them.
Thursday's debate was originally scheduled to be the third and final one, but Trump scuttled a second appearance earlier this month after refusing to take part remotely following his hospitalization with COVID-19. After Headlines will spend the rest of the hour on last night's presidential debate. The United States confirmed more than 71,000 new coronavirus infections Thursday, one of the worst daily tolls of the U.S. outbreak so far. North Dakota has suspended contact tracing efforts as a backlog of cases overwhelmed National Guard soldiers assigned to track down the contacts of infected people. As of Thursday, North Dakota's hospitals had just 14 intensive care unit beds available statewide. Data compiled by Johns Hopkins shows that if North Dakota were a nation, it would have the highest number of per capita COVID-19 cases in the world. In Wisconsin, a massive field hospital outside Milwaukee admitted its first COVID-19 patient Thursday as Wisconsin's infections continued to surge to record high levels. Utah Governor Gary Herbert warned Thursday the state's healthcare system is at or near capacity. In Massachusetts, Boston's school superintendent Thursday canceled plans to resume in-person learning at public schools. In Houston, Texas, teachers at dozens of schools staged sick-out protests Thursday, demanding smaller class sizes, enforced social distancing, and mask wearing, better classroom ventilation, and other safety measures at schools. The Food and Drug Administration's approved remdesivir as the first COVID-19 treatment in the United States. Some studies have shown the antiviral drug may reduce the number of days COVID-19 patients are hospitalized, though a large World Health Organization study published last week found remdesivir fails to prevent deaths among COVID-19 patients. Coronavirus cases continue to surge across Europe, where the Czech Republic is reporting the highest per capita infection rate in the world. On Wednesday, the Czech Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, apologized as he announced a new nationwide lockdown, the second of the year. In Paris, the French Prime Minister has extended a nightly curfew to cover 46 million people, about two-thirds of the French population.
To put things simply, the situation is serious. It's serious in Europe. It's serious in France.
India has seen a downturn in new coronavirus cases after peaking last month at nearly 100,000 confirmed infections per day. India is still reporting some 50,000 daily cases. In eastern Bihar state, the party of Prime Minister Narendra Modi has promised residents free doses of a future coronavirus vaccine, but only if the party wins in the November 10th elections. Opposition parties blasted the move, saying Modi's party is exploiting the pandemic for political gain. Back in the United States, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted 12-0 Thursday to recommend Amy Coney Barrett be confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Republican Chairman Senator Lindsey Graham disregarded his committee's own rules requiring a quorum be present and proceeded with the vote after all 10 of the Judiciary Committee's Democrats boycotted Thursday's roll call. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell plans to hold a vote in the full Senate as early as Monday. Senate Democrats have called the rush to confirm Barrett so close to the election an illegitimate power grab, and reproductive health advocates warned Barrett could help overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court case affirming the right to an abortion. Meanwhile, environmentalists are warning Barrett's refusal to acknowledge the science of climate change could spell disaster for efforts to mitigate the worst effects of the climate crisis. Lori Lodes of the group Climate Power 2020 wrote, quote, "The last thing our country can afford is a climate denier who will use her lifetime seat on the Supreme Court to block climate action and roll back our environmental laws for decades to come," she said. In Colorado, a wildfire raging in Rocky Mountain National Park exploded in size Thursday by more than 100,000 acres, jumping the Continental Divide and leaving residents of mountain towns scrambling to evacuate. The East Troublesome Fire has grown to over 170,000 acres, the second largest wildfire ever recorded in Colorado. Meanwhile, firefighters continue to battle the largest wildfire in Colorado history, the nearby Cameron Peak fire. Massive smoke plumes from Colorado's fires reached into the stratosphere, shrouding the sun and turning skies orange as far away as Minnesota and Wisconsin. In immigration news, The Guardian reports many of the Cameroonian asylum seekers who were recently deported en masse were subjected to torture by Immigration and Customs Enforcement guards to force them to sign their removal papers. Asylum seekers were reportedly choked, beaten, pepper-sprayed, and received death threats. Others were handcuffed as ICE agents forcibly took their fingerprints in place of signatures. Last week, 60 Cameroonian and over 24 Congolese asylum seekers were deported, including 2 Cameroonian women who feared they were unknowingly subjected to forced sterilization at Irwin Detention Center in Georgia, according to immigration advocates. Many of the Cameroonian asylum seekers feared they would be killed upon their arrival to their home country. In more immigration news, the Los Angeles Times reports at least 19 women are alleging they were subjected to invasive gynecological procedures without their consent while imprisoned at the privately run Irwin Detention Center in Georgia, including undergoing unnecessary procedures that affected their ability to have children. Most of the women are asylum seekers from the Caribbean, Africa, and Latin America. In related news, The Intercept reports Google technology will be deployed to the U.S.-Mexico border to assist in border security enforcement. Customs and Border Protection reportedly agreed on a deal with Google in August to collaborate in a new so-called virtual border wall, which combines surveillance towers, drones, and sensors aimed at detecting asylum seekers crossing into the United States. In Florida, top election officials are being accused of voter suppression after abruptly enacting 2 last-minute rules affecting formerly incarcerated people and the operation of ballot drop boxes. Last week, Florida's Republican Secretary of State announced election officials were beginning to flag people for potential removal from voter rolls if they had outstanding court debts. A second rule forces ballot drop boxes to be staffed at all times, forcing election officials to restructure the setup of ballot drop boxes just days before Election Day. In more election news, the Supreme Court has reinstated curbside voting ban in Alabama, overturning a lower court's ruling meant to protect people with disabilities during the pandemic. This comes as the Texas Supreme Court ruled it will allow drive-through voting, rejecting a challenge from the Republican Party. The Labor Department reports 787,000 U.S. workers filed new unemployment claims last week, the second lowest total since March, but still historically high compared to pre-pandemic levels. This comes as a new report by Americans for Tax Fairness found the collective wealth of billionaires in the United States has jumped by $931 billion since mid-March. The report also found 22 million U.S. adults reported not having enough food to eat, and more than half of those adults had children in their households. Nearly 62 million U.S. residents lost work between mid-March and mid-November. President Trump's issued an executive order that would grant him more power to easily hire and fire tens of thousands of federal workers. Federal employee union leaders have condemned the executive order, calling it, quote, the most profound undermining of the civil service in our lifetimes and the biggest change to federal workforce protections in at least a century. The order would allow the president to crack down on his critics, for example, public health officials who speak out about the administration's handling of the pandemic. In Venezuela, President Nicolás Maduro has asked lawmakers to begin discussions on marriage equality in January. This follows Pope Francis's recently published comments supporting civil unions for LGBTQ people. This is Maduro speaking Thursday.
I have friends and acquaintances who are very happy with what the Pope said yesterday. I will leave that task, the task of LGBT marriage, to the next National Assembly.
And Poland's highest court has declared almost all forms of abortion unconstitutional, tightening anti-choice laws that were already among the most restrictive in Europe. Protesters marched on the Constitutional Tribunal in Warsaw Thursday, just after the court's ruling.
What the government is doing to us today is not only taking away our women's rights, but also our human rights. For the first time, we can confidently say that in Poland, we have the worst abortion law in Europe.
Following Thursday's ruling, Poland will only allow abortions in cases of rape, incest, or a threat to the pregnant person's health and life. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 tops 223,000, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden met in Nashville, Tennessee Thursday in the second and final debate of the 2020 campaign. They sparred over the Trump administration's response to the pandemic, health care, climate change, racism, and U.S. immigration policy. Thursday's matchup was originally scheduled to be the third and final debate, but Trump scuttled a second appearance earlier this month after refusing to take part remotely following his hospitalization with COVID-19. Thursday's debate was moderated by NBC's Kristen Welker, who began by asking President Trump about his handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Trump praised his response while falsely claiming that 2.2 million people were expected to die and falsely claiming a vaccine was, quote, ready.
We have a vaccine that's coming. It's ready. It's going to be announced within weeks, and it's going to be delivered. We have Operation Warp Speed, which is the military is going to distribute the vaccine. I can tell you from personal experience that I was in the hospital. I had it, and I got better. And I will tell you that I had something that they gave me, a therapeutic, I guess they would call it. Some people could say it was a cure. But I was in for a short period of time, and I got better very fast, or I wouldn't be here tonight. And now they say I'm immune. Whether it's 4 months or a lifetime, nobody's been able to say that, but I'm immune. More and more people are getting better. We have a problem that's a worldwide problem. This is a worldwide problem. But I've been congratulated by the heads of many countries on what we've been able to do. If you take a look at what we've done in terms of goggles and masks and gowns and everything else, and in particular ventilators. We're now making ventilators all over the world, thousands and thousands a month, distributing them all over the world. It will go away, and as I say, we're rounding the turn, we're rounding the corner. It's going away.
Okay, former Vice President Biden, to you, how would you lead the country out of this crisis? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. Anyone who's responsible for not taking control, in fact, not saying I take no responsibility initially, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America. We're in a situation where there are 1,000 deaths a day now, 1,000 deaths a day, and there are over 70,000 new cases per day. Compared to what's going on in Europe, as the New England Medical Journal said, they're starting from a very low rate. We're starting from a very high rate. The expectation is we'll have another 200,000 Americans dead between now and the end of the year. If we just wore these masks, the president's own advisors have told him, we could save 100,000 lives. And we're in a circumstance where the president thus far and still has no plan, no comprehensive plan.
Later in the debate, former Vice President Joe Biden criticized Trump for downplaying the pandemic.
He did virtually nothing, and then he gets out of the hospital and he talks about don't worry, it's all going to be over soon. Come on. There's not another serious scientist in the world who thinks it's going to be over soon.
President Trump, your reaction?
I say over soon. I say we're learning to live with it. We have no choice. 99.9% of young people recover. 99% of people recover. We have to recover. We can't close up our nation. We have to open our school, and we can't close up our nation, or you're not going to have a nation.
He says that we're learning to live with it. People are learning to die with it. You folks home will have an empty chair at the kitchen table this morning. That man or wife going to bed tonight and reaching over to try to touch out of habit where their wife or husband was, is gone. Learning to live with it. Come on. We're dying with it because he has never said, he said it's dangerous. When's the last time? Is it really dangerous still? Are we dangerous? You tell the people it's dangerous now? What should they do about the danger? And you say, I take no responsibility.
Let me talk about your two.
Excuse me, I take full responsibility. It's not my fault that he came here. It's China's fault.
President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden at last night's debate in Nashville. To get response, we are joined by Dr. Ali Khan. He is an epidemiologist and the Dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's the former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, where he oversaw the Strategic National Stockpile. He's joining us from Omaha, Nebraska. Nebraska is one of 7 states now seeing a record level of COVID hospitalizations. Dr. Ali Khan, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you respond to that last comment of President Trump's as he says he is not responsible for this?
So good morning, Amy, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this morning. Before I respond to the last comment, let's step back a little bit and think how unusual this would be if we replaced COVID with polio or cholera or dysentery, that we would have a presidential debate and 2 different opposing political opinions about a disease that's the 3rd leading cause of death in America now that was unknown 10 months ago, and we would be having a debate on whether or not it's killing people and how it's killing people. It's unimaginable if you just replace COVID with anything else, but that's essentially what's happening. And what COVID has done very effectively is it has taken advantage of every splinter in our society. First, in terms of biologically, elderly males we know are at higher risk. Then social politically, economically, it's extremely unfortunate what's going on in America with it's 300,000 deaths right now.
Explain what you mean by 300,000 deaths.
So the 220,000 deaths that are reported are an underreport of deaths. And what you really need to look at, in addition to the actual individual cases that are reported, is excess deaths. And CDC has recently done a very nice analysis of looking at all excess deaths. So these are people who would not have died. So it's not as if I've often hear that, oh, they were elderly, they were going to die anyway. That's not true. These are individuals who would not have died this year who are dead, and that's over 300,000. And yes, while absolutely there's a lot more elderly people who have died if you look relatively, there's more deaths amongst the 25 to 44-year-olds, and there's more deaths around Latinos are more likely to die. So yes, approximately 300,000 deaths in America, third leading cause of death for a disease that was unknown in December.
Can you respond to the Columbia University report that just came out, the study where researchers blasted the Trump administration over its disastrous handling of the pandemic? The authors write, we estimate at least 130,000 deaths, perhaps as many as 210,000, could have been avoided with earlier policy interventions and more robust federal coordination and leadership, even with the dramatic recent appearance of new COVID-19 waves globally, the abject failures of U.S. government policies and crisis messaging persist. Talk about what this means, what Trump did and didn't do, as he talks about how well he dealt with the pandemic.
So, Amy, this paper that came out of Columbia University by Dr. Urban Redletter really puts estimates on how many people have unnecessarily died of this disease, and it tries to estimate those preventable deaths. So it's always good, I appreciate American exceptionalism, but you just need to go look at what's going on in the rest of the world. China, 0 deaths. Their economy in the third quarter increased 4.9%, okay? And it's not just China. New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, Uruguay, Uzbekistan, I can go on and on all over the world were countries where they had a robust public health strategy to decrease cases in their countries, and they are down to 0 to no cases. So what this new paper says is if we had just followed what we know the science is, so the science, we know how to get rid of this disease. Test, trace, and isolate, community engagement, that's masks, social distancing, hand washing, and excellent leadership at national, state, and local level. You put that controlled triad together, and the U.S. would not have had these preventable deaths. And again, this is what happened in the past. I'm worried now about what's happening in the future. We continue to see approximately 700 deaths, preventable deaths every day in America because we still don't have a containment strategy in America. We still don't have that leadership, not just at the national level, state and local level, because public health is a local activity. So where's that test, tracing, and isolating happening? Where are those national and state and local mandates for masks, hand washing, social distancing? We know what it takes to get this disease under control. It's not a secret from a scientific standpoint.
This is the key point, Dr. Khan, that you say not just about the past here, but the future. As President Trump goes around the country now with his rallies, not clear when the last time was he met with the coronavirus task force, we're talking about possibly as many people dying in the next few months as have died so far in this country, right? Over 200,000 people, you say 300,000, since the beginning of the pandemic. What can be put in place right now? You were head of the national stockpile. You worked at the CDC for years. Can you talk about, even if it is late, what President Trump needs to do with invoking the Defense Production Act, still getting millions of tests and masks to people? He keeps saying anyone can get a test. It is just an absolute lie.
So you're quite right, Amy. Even we can start today to prevent these 700 to 1,000 deaths that are happening every day. We have the tools. We've always had the tools. It starts at the top, and then it cascades to the national, state, local, county, city, tribal, territorial level, which is you need that unified leadership. As I said, if just think about it, we're arguing about a disease. This is great for COVID-19. It's not good for us, right? That leadership that we are going to contain this disease. We know what the science is to get this disease under control. We're going to use evidence. We're going to use metrics. We're going to use data, and we're going to drive down this disease. The second thing we're going to do is we need to ramp up test, trace, and isolate. So there is obviously gaps in testing in the United States, but there's a lot of testing in the United States. But you have to link the testing with action. It's not just about anybody who wants a test can get a test, because many people don't even need a test. But the ones who do need a test, if they're positive, have you made sure that they're isolated? Have you found their contacts? Have you quarantined their contacts in a socially viable manner? And if you don't do that, then why bother to test people, right? And then the third thing is starting at the local level, where are the mask mandates to make sure people are wearing masks, making sure there's social distancing, whatever that looks like in that community based on what's going on, and then making sure that they're washing hands. I mean, we have the tools to get America back to work, to get all the kids back in school, and to get fans back in stadiums. We have those tools right now if we wanted to use them.
Quickly, if you could respond to what Trump is using as a pretext for not doing anything, and that is saying herd immunity, let the population get sick.
Oh my gosh, that is the most unethical, disastrous approach that's possible. So herd immunity is a wonderful concept when we use vaccine to get herd immunity. However, herd immunity has never been used previously. It would be the analogous of saying there's an Ebola outbreak and we go, oh, let's go infect everybody, so that it's less disruptive in our society. So herd immunity is the maximum death strategy, which is you kill as many people as possible until potentially people are immune. Well, A, that's so ludicrous, nobody's ever tried it before. B, it ignores the fact that you may have long-term sequelae. So I know people like to say 99% of people survive. Well, at a population level, unfortunately, 1% is still 3 million people in the US. But we do know that potentially a third of people, a quarter of people may have long-term heart, lung, kidney, and brain damage. So there's still these long-term side effects that we're not accounting for. And then finally, if this disease really causes reinfections in 4 to 6 months, herd immunity can't work. We get the cold every year. We have not yet had herd immunity to the cold virus, which is another type of coronavirus.
Which goes to
herd immunity is unethical.
Which goes to one of the first things President Trump said last night. He said, you know, he had COVID and now he's immune.
And he may not, president or not, you know, if you get infected, you may not be immune forever. And we don't know how long that immunity lasts. We know that there have been some cases of reinfection. So that, again, says, how can you have herd immunity if you can get reinfected? So correct. We hope that you're protected for a very long period of time, but we need to get disease down to zero so that we don't have infections in our community.
Before you go, I wanted to ask you about the Affordable Care Act. At one point in the 90-minute debate, Trump conflated Biden's call for a government-run public option health care plan with a Medicare for All bill authored by Bernie Sanders.
When he talks about a public option, he's talking about destroying your Medicare, totally destroying, and destroying your Social Security. And this whole country will come down. You know, Bernie Sanders tried it in his state.
He's a very confused guy. He thinks he's running against somebody else. He's running against Joe Biden. I beat all those other people because I disagreed with them.
Dr. Ali Khan, I'm wondering if you could comment overall about Medicare for All. As President Trump went after socialized medicine, he didn't talk about being at Walter Reed Theater, where he dealt with his COVID-19. Isn't that the epitome of socialized medicine, and very fine socialized medicine at that?
And yeah, actually, military medicine is quite excellent medicine, as is Medicare in the United States, which is an excellent healthcare system in the United States for the elderly and select others that's actually cost effective. And again, American exceptionalism, if you look outside the U.S., numerous countries have figured out how to solve this universal access issue, and we need to solve that problem in America. People like to talk about the new normal. I like to talk about the better normal, because there's lots of things about the old normal I didn't like. You know, institutional racism would be one of them. But again, everybody needs to have access to health care in our better normal.
Dr. Ali Khan, I want to thank you for being with us, epidemiologist, Dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, where he oversaw the Strategic National Stockpile. He is in Nebraska, which is one of the 7 states right now with record hospitalizations. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we continue with the excerpts of last night's debate. Stay with us.
2016 on election day, things jumped off in a hell of a way. I'm not mad, but my face is sore. Wearing scuba gear at the grocery store. Jamie Dimon said to Jesse James, running a bank beats robbing a train. Can't even seem to get no gold. They pay me like a kid, but I'm getting old. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Let the poor man live and the rich go bust. Swinging on batons, I jumped through the alley and over a wall. Dodged a rubber cannonball.
Let the Rich Go Bust by the Downhill Strugglers. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. This is the Quarantine Report. As we continue to cover the final presidential debate, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden sparred Thursday on their records over race and criminal justice. Let's turn to debate moderator Kristen Welker of NBC.
Mr. President, you've described the Black Lives Matter movement as a symbol of hate. You've shared a video of a man chanting white power to millions of your supporters. You've said that black professional athletes exercising their First Amendment rights should be fired. What do you say to Americans who say that kind of language from a president is contributing to a climate of hate and racial strife?
Well, you have to understand, the first time I ever heard of Black Lives Matter, they were chanting pigs in a blanket, talking about police. Pigs, talking about our police. Pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon. I said, that's a horrible thing. And they were marching down the street. And that was my first glimpse of Black Lives Matter. I thought it was a terrible thing. As far as my relationships with all people, I think I have great relationships with all people. I am the least racist person in this room.
Well, what do you say to Americans who are concerned by that rhetoric?
I don't know. I don't know what to say. I got criminal justice reform done and prison reform and opportunity zones. I took care of black colleges and universities. I don't know what to say.
Abraham Lincoln here is one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history. He pours fuel on every single racist fire. Every single one. Started off his campaign coming down the escalator saying he's going to get rid of those Mexican rapists. He's banned Muslims because they're Muslims. He has moved around and made everything worse across the board. He says about the poor boys, last time we were on stage here, he said, I told them to stand down and stand ready. Come on. This guy has a dog whistle about as big as a foghorn.
We're joined right now by Rashad Robinson, spokesperson for Color of Change PAC. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Rashad. Your response to what they're saying there and overall to the debate.
You know, I mean, I think one of the things that when these conversations happen about race, we oftentimes sort of hear a whole bunch of disparities, or we hear, you know, candidates trying to talk about what they're going to do for the community. And, you know, that I think is helpful to some extent, but I think that what we're oftentimes seeing, I think what I hope we can see more from the Democrats is actually really leaning into how racial justice is not just about what you're going to do for the community. Racial justice is also a strategy about how we actually win on the wide range of things that we can win on, from healthcare to climate to so much more, because part of the problems of why we don't have the things that we need in this country is because of systems set up around racial inequality. And so we shouldn't just follow the ball that Donald Trump lays down about the racism that's at the heart of his campaign, some of the sort of racial enabling and racism that's at the heart of the Republican Party. We know all of that. What are we going to actually do to motivate people not just to hate Trump, but to love the other side in return. I think that's going to be the ongoing task, not just about winning elections. It's about governing. It's about having the power to actually overcome the barriers that oftentimes stand in the way of moving us forward on the issues that impact sort of the climate around race, that impact Black and brown communities every single day.
Can you talk about COVID when it comes to the African-American community, when it comes to communities of color all over this country, the disproportionate effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of, I think, the challenge of how we need to unlock the power of racial justice, right? So when we talk about COVID, we will hear folks say, Black folks are dying. But in fact, Black folks are being killed by government action, by corporate power, by an insurance industry. When we talk about the structural issues that impact Black communities in a passive voice and rather than an active voice, we spend all of our time talking about how do we fix Black people and Black families rather than fixing the structures that harm and hurt us. I mean, we do this across the board, whether it's saying Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank instead of actually saying banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. And so when we talk about COVID, it's not that COVID, the disease itself is racist, it's that America is racist. And the structures and the systems that we have set up have simply exposed all these challenges. But when we talk about these problems in a passive voice, when we talk about these things like it's just happening to the community, not that the poverty and inequality and racism is part of a manufactured structure, that there's corporate power and other systems at every turn benefiting from the sort of impact of these decisions, then we end up sort of really focused on treating communities like they are vulnerable rather than actually treating communities like they've been targeted, attacked, exploited. It actually leads us to a very different set of solutions when we talk about the structural problems in an active voice rather than a passive voice, because when we talk about it in an active voice, we actually focus on solving the problems at hand rather than trying to fix people.
I wanted to talk about for a moment the debate moderator. Kristen Welker is the first woman of color, the first African-American woman to preside over, to moderate a presidential debate since Carol Simpson did in 1992. And at every turn in these last weeks, President Trump went after her viciously, tweeting against her. Yesterday, he released the 60 Minutes interview before 60 Minutes released it. He was interviewed by Leslie Stahl and then walked out of it. And he attacked Leslie Stahl. And then he said, and Kristen Welker is even worse.
Yeah, I mean, and then you saw him on stage sort of playing and saying nice things to her before and after. This is the showman, right? This is Donald Trump. I mean, and I think part of what we have to recognize is all the ways he's been able to do this his whole career. I saw a clip going around yesterday of sort of an interview that he had with Connie Chung years ago, and then the things that he said about her afterwards, right? This is a president that got here because so many folks enabled him. He was on NBC's platform on Celebrity Apprentice once a week with corporate sponsors while he was going around the country spreading a racist conspiracy theory about President Obama, and was allowed to continue to have that platform. And when that happens, we sort of lower the standards of what's acceptable and create sort of a situation where some of these things are just allowed as acceptable part of the debate. But the thing I want to say about the debate moderator, Kristen Welker, is that I think that, she really leaned in a way that we did not see in the last debates. I think she followed up. She really used the opportunity to press both candidates on the issues and try to get them to answer the question. And for folks who are activists out there listening, for people who have been showing up to protest and showing up to raise their voice, whether it's online or offline in this moment, I think activists activism was on the stage in a very interesting way. And I think that's important because we haven't had town hall meetings. We haven't had the sort of opportunities to question the candidates up front, for those moments for immigrant activists and BLM activists and others and climate activists to press the candidates in forums that were sort of more open. But on that stage, I think what you saw was Kristen actually pushing these candidates as a result of the larger activism in the space, the way that the conversations and movements on the street have actually changed the dialogue. And whether it was the first debates that we saw on the Democratic side, where you saw a whole new set of issues being talked about, from reparations to racial injustice to white supremacy. For the first time on a presidential debate, I think back to being in middle school during that Carol Simpson debate, and probably the first debate I watched at home with my family, really coming off of getting to understand and learn about the presidential debate when my parents in 1988 gave some of our vacation money to Jesse Jackson's presidential run. And I think about how far some of these conversations have come, how far we are at talking about these issues. And I think what's going to be important if Joe Biden becomes the president is that we recognize that we can't mistake the presence of our issues on debate stage for the power to actually change the rules. And we're going to have to press and push and challenge and build power. And for folks who are out there, they're going to have to invest in Black and brown infrastructure to actually channel that energy so that we get the type of change that makes people's participation valuable and over the years can be a force multiplier for more people to want to participate in our democracy, because they see the result of the type of change their participation brings about.
I want to go to debate moderator Kristen Welker of NBC.
Crime bills that you supported in the 80s and 90s contributed to the incarceration of tens of thousands of young Black men who had small amounts of drugs in their possession. They are sons, they are brothers, their fathers, their uncles, whose families are still to this day, some of them suffering the consequences. So speak to those families. Why should they vote for you?
One of the things is that in the 80s, we passed 100%, all 100 senators voted for it, a bill on drugs and how to deal with drugs. It was a mistake. I've been trying to change the sense, and particularly the portion on cocaine. That's why I've been arguing that, in fact, we should not send anyone to jail for a pure drug offense. They should be going into treatment across the board. That's what we should be spending money on. That's why I set up drug courts, which were never funded by our Republican friends. They should not be going to jail for a drug or an alcohol problem. They should be going into treatment. That's what we've been trying to do. That's what I'm going to get done, because I think the American people have now seen that, in fact, it was a mistake to pass those laws relating to the drug. But they were not in the crime bill.
But why didn't he get it done? See, it's all talk, no action with these politicians. Why didn't he get it done? That's what I'm going to do when I become president. You were vice president along with Obama as your president, your leader, for 8 years. Why didn't you get it done? You had 8 years to get it done. Now you're saying you're going to get it done because you're all talk and no action, Jim.
We got a lot of it done. We released 38,000. We got 38,000 prisoners left from the.
You got nothing done.
38,000 prisoners were released from federal prison. There were over 1,000 people who were given clemency. In fact, we're the ones that put in the legislation saying we could look at pattern and practice of police departments and what they were doing, how they were conducting themselves. I could go on, but we began the process. We lost an election. That's why I'm running to win back that election and change his terrible policy.
So there's Joe Biden and Trump. Trump taking on the crime bill. Rashad Robinson, if you can respond.
It's just so much misinformation and disinformation. I think this is part of the challenge that organizations like mine have in sort of parsing this through, where Donald Trump is somehow trying to make himself an advocate for criminal justice reform or even drug reform when we know his history and even how the First Step Act came about. I'm not here to defend the Democrats on criminal justice reform. I'm here to say that they are the party that we have the best chance of pushing to do the right thing. They're the folks most likely to be nervous about disappointing us on this issue. But both parties have a lot of work to do, and that is without false equivalencies. I think the thing that's important here is that Joe Biden and his campaign are acknowledging the flaws and the problems in previous decisions about how they dealt with drug policy, about how they dealt with criminal justice, acknowledging on the stage last week that the '94 crime bill was a mistake. And I think that that is important. That's a representation of a lot of pushing challenges from those outside and inside of the campaign. And now we need to see that translate into the type of energy and heat necessary to actually make changes on those things, and the type of changes that are not just sort of the cosmetic changes that stop the bleeding, but actually the type of changes that restore people's lives and dignities that have been stolen for them. You know, we have drug laws on the books that are just simply designed to target and exploit Black people, and it starts all the way down with marijuana that is essentially legal for rich people and for white people in this country, and we still see Black and brown people being locked up, all the way up to all the disparities in other drugs. It has failed and it has not worked. And we actually have to build systems of harm reduction, systems that actually allow for people to have the things that they need and people to have the privacy in their lives that they need as well. But I do think that is a fundamental change in the conversation and the debate. But I do think, once again, you've got this sort of showman in Donald Trump that's willing to say anything. And he's trying a very interesting dance on the stage. On one hand, making these deep appeals to law enforcement. On the other hand, trying to make these appeals to Black men at the same time, and doing it in ways that sort of can be confusing and complicated. But because he's such a showman, sometimes it can get over. And that misinformation and disinformation about where he actually stands on the issue is part of why we have to continue challenge. But it's also why the Democrats can't just make this about hating Trump. They also have to continue to fight and build and put out the policies that are going to change lives and remove barriers and systems that have stood in people's way.
Rashad Robinson is spokesperson for Color of Change PAC. When we come back, we'll also be joined by Erica Andiola, the immigrant rights activist, and get her response to the issue raised of the 545 immigrant children in this country. Where are their parents that the Trump administration separated from them? Stay with us.
It's not easy to survive.
The Kids Are Still in Cages by Nancy Sanchez. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend the hour looking at the final presidential debate after President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden faced off in Nashville, Tennessee, Thursday night. Moderator Kristen Welker was the first of the moderators in this presidential debate season to ask about immigration.
The United States can't locate the parents of more than 500 children. So how will these families ever be reunited?
Children are brought here by coyotes and lots of bad people, cartels, and they're brought here, and they used to use them to get into our country. We now have as strong a border as we've ever had. We're over 400 miles of brand new wall. You see the numbers, and we let people in, but they have to come in legally, and they come in through merit.
But how will you reunite these kids with their families,
Let me just tell you,
Mr. President?
they built cages. You know, they used to say, I built the cages, and then they had a picture in a certain newspaper, and it was a picture of these horrible cages, and they said, look at these cages. President Trump built them, and then it was determined they were built in 2014. That was him.
Do you have a plan to reunite the kids?
Yes,
with
we're
their
working on it we're trying very hard. But a lot of these kids come out without the parents. They come over through cartels and through coyotes and through gangs.
Vice President Biden, let me bring you into this conversation. Quick response and then another question to you.
These 500 plus kids came with parents. They separated them at the border to make it a disincentive to come to begin with. Bay, real tough. We're really strong. And guess what? They cannot, it's not coyotes didn't bring them over. Their parents were with them. They got separated from their parents. And it makes us a laughing stock and violates every notion of who we are as a nation.
Let me ask you a follow-up
Kristen,
question.
they did it. We changed the policy.
Your response
they
to
did
that?
It. We changed.
Did not
They built the cages. Who built the cages, Joe?
Let's talk about what
Who
we're
built the
talking
cages,
about. Let's
Joe?
talk about what we're talking about. What happened? Parents were ripped, their kids were ripped from their arms and separated. And now they cannot find over 500 of sets of those parents, and those kids are alone. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. It's criminal. It's criminal.
Let me ask
Kristen,
you about
I will say this.
immigration.
They went
10
down. We
seconds, and
brought
then I need to ask
reporters,
you.
everything. They are so well taken care of.
We go now to Phoenix, Arizona, to bring Erica Andiola into this conversation. She's advocacy chief at IASIS Action, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, also host of the podcast Homeland Insecurity. As you listen to this discussion, Erica, these 545 children, this has been raised, the government was forced to admit this, as groups like the ACLU and others cannot find the parents of these children who are still in the United States. Explain this situation and what Trump has responded.
Yes. So there are still kids here in the United States who have not been able to be reunited with their parents. And we have to remember why that is. And the reason for that is that majority of these children were not tracked. Their parents were actually not tracked by the U.S. government when they were taken away from their parents and from their family members. And so what Trump said, and, what he claims that, he's taking care of these children, that he wasn't the one, who was putting them in cages, all these things that he's saying, they're really lies. And also, I want to make sure that we're not just focused on the cages. What the cages are really is they're these structures that were created by the Border Patrol, which migrants actually call them perreras, which is like dog kennels, right? That are used to hold immigrants or migrants who come, not just the children, but also individuals, adults, and families when they first cross the border. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. And yes, that was there under the Obama administration and even before that. What Trump did was that he literally created a policy called zero tolerance, which took children away from their families at the border so that they would send a message, that's what Trump would say, and his administration, to other migrants so that they wouldn't come anymore into the United States. And so zero tolerance policy was created by Donald Trump, and he is not owning up to that. He did it, and these children are still trying to figure out how to find their parents, and the United States is not doing enough to be able to make that happen.
I want to go back to debate moderator Kristen Welker of NBC. Again, the first to raise in the presidential debates the issue of immigration.
Mr. Vice President, the Obama administration did fail to deliver immigration reform, which had been a key promise during the administration. It also presided over record deportations as well as family detentions at the border before changing course. So why should voters trust you with an immigration overhaul now?
Because it made a mistake. It took too long to get it right. It took too long to get it right. I'll be president of the United States, not vice president of the United States. And the fact is, I've made it very clear. Within 100 days, I'm going to send to the United States Congress a pathway to citizenship for over 11 million undocumented people. And all of those so-called dreamers, those DACA kids, they're going to be immediately certified again to be able to stay in this country and put on a path to citizenship.
He had 8 years to do what he said he was going to do. And I've changed without having a specific. We got rid of catch and release. We got rid of a lot of horrible things that they put in and that they lived with. But he had 8 years he was vice president. He did nothing except build cages to keep children in.
Vice President Biden, your response.
The catch and release, you know what he's talking about there? If in fact you had a family came across and they were arrested, they in fact were given a date to show up for their hearing. They were released, and guess what? They showed up for a hearing. And this is the first president in the history of the United States of America that anybody seeking asylum has to do it in another country. That's never happened before in America.
Erica Andiola, if you can respond to the Obama-Biden record and also this whole issue of catch and release. Trump falsely said only 1% of people show up for immigration hearings. It's something like 75%.
That's correct. There's a lot there. And the first thing I'll say is that it is something that I found really positive to hear Biden said that they made a mistake. I think they made many mistakes. And let's just be clear on that. It wasn't just that they didn't do immigration reform right away, that needed Congress to pass, and they didn't push hard enough. But also, in the meantime, they created a deportation system and a detention system that now has been used and even made worse by Donald Trump. And so I want to make sure that is said, because we have to fix both mistakes. If Biden is elected, we have to make sure that we are, yes, pushing Congress to have a path to citizenship for undocumented people, but also at the same time that we are dismantling this deportation and detention machine that was really strengthened by the Obama administration and now terribly used by the Trump administration. Now, with Trump saying this, with catch and release, with everything that he's now pointing back to the Obama administration, well, he has made all of this even worse. And the fact is that what he's done right now with asylum seekers is completely inhumane. Now we have literally almost dismantled the entire asylum process for migrants. And so what you have, is people who are stuck now in Mexico waiting because of Remain in Mexico policy, or MPP, who are now camping in tents on the other side of the border with their children, and now dealing with COVID. They can't get in. And like you said, the majority of people who are allowed to come, who are allowed to share their story of why they need to be in this country seeking asylum and are given the chance to go see a judge, they show up. We know this. Our attorneys represent these migrants and immigrants, and we know that they show up and that we show up to court when we have to do it. We just need to be given the chance, and Trump has completely dismantled that.
I want to end with an exchange between Trump and Biden on combating climate change.
Transition from the oil industry, yes. It has to be replaced by renewable energy over time. And I'd stop giving to the oil industry, I'd stop giving them federal subsidies. He won't give federal subsidies to the gas, to solar and wind. Yeah. Why are we giving it to oil industry?
We actually do give it to solar and wind.
We
and
have
that's
one
maybe the
final
biggest
question,
statement he is
Mr.
going
President.
to destroy the oil industry. Okay. Will you remember that, Texas? Will you remember that, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma?
I wanted to bring Rashad Robinson of Color of Change PAC back into this 30-second response on the issue of climate crisis.
I thought it was a big step for Biden to be so clear. I know his campaign's walking back some aspects of it, but the larger piece to speak so clearly on the stage about oil. And then you have Donald Trump on the other end at every turn, not actually issuing a belief about anything, but speaking specifically to states, talking about the strategy. It's sort of what he does. I do think that we are seeing the results of a lot of work and effort and activism, of pushing the Democratic Party, of raising the stakes on what we are facing in terms of climate and in terms of what has been allowed by major corporations to be able to pollute our environment, and particularly to be able to put so much pollution right at the back door of Black and brown communities.
And Erica Andiola, you tweeted last night that you grew up near an ExxonMobil plant. You know what frontline communities are about. 10 seconds.
We do. And again, as the pandemic right now shows, every time there's something happening in the environment, something that is happening outside of our control, people of color, communities of color, Black communities, Native American communities, undocumented people are the ones who suffer the most. And so we need to make sure that, yes, climate change is at the top of the agenda of the next president. And we don't know what Biden is going to do, but at this point, we know what Trump has not done.
We have to leave it there. Erica Andiola and
Yes,
Rashad Robinson, thanks so much. I'm Amy Goodman. Special thanks to Julie Crosby.